Welcome to the Family Pictures Podcast. I'm Michael Branson Smith, and I'm here with Jim Groom.
Hello.
And today, Jim, I'm actually a little nervous.
Oh, why?
Because we're doing, for the first time, an actual great film. With, not one of our usual, hey, this is one of our favorite trashy 80 films that, we're nostalgic about. We're doing 400 Blows, directed by François Truffaut, a personal favorite hero of mine of cinema, who I crafted a self-study of when I was a graduate student in art school who was trying to study film at an art school, which was a disaster in a different manner. And he, creates this film in 1959, and we're doing 400. So 400 Blows, 1959 is his first film at age 25, right?
Yeah.
And he is very autobiographical, which we'll get into. But what's I think interesting is he had previously been a critic, right? And a very famous critic.
Yeah, like how precocious is this guy?
Well,
at the ripe age of 25.
Right. Well, it reminds me in a funny way of Quentin Tarantino in this like intense adoration of film itself, right? Like he described in one of his interviews after 400 Blows had come out, he had watched over like 3,000 films, right? Yeah. Like he had this personal goal of 3 films a day, 3 books a week, but he was an absolute delinquent of a kid himself. Like he was expelled multiple times, and, he starts a film club at age 16 and meets the famous film critic Andre Bazin, who sadly dies right before this film is released, and is a true father figure to him. And he like tries to desert the army at age 18, and it's Bazin that saves him and puts him in. And it's like, look, here's something for you to do. Write for our magazine, Cahiers du Cinéma, which is probably one of the most important pieces of literature that transforms filmmaking, right? Yeah. And this is because he and Bazin are the ones that say, like, you know what? There are certain people, when they make movies, they're special. They're special because they have a point of view, and they somehow, through the Hollywood system or the French, filmmaking system, are able to craft a consistent vision and stylistic perspective unlike anybody else. And interestingly, he was this incredible fan of Hitchcock. And Hitchcock at the time in the United States was seen as just like a popcorn fare, right?
Yeah. And
to think that now is kind of hilarious, right? Like that Hitchcock was simply like, oh, he's doing yet another trashy kind of, thriller, right? Oh, he's doing this thing with, people falling downstairs back, or just putting lights in milk. And so, which is my favorite example of what Truffaut got him to talk about. But it's Truffaut and he talked about enduring questions from Americans like, why do you think this guy's so great, like Hitchcock? And he's like, why do you guys not think he's great, right? And so he incredibly creates this relationship with Hitchcock, and after he's made 400 Blows, and they write one another, and they're just exchanging viewpoints in cinema, and Hitchcock agrees to be interviewed by him. And it becomes this 3-day affair with a translator, because Truffaut knows no English, which is amazing. And he gets Truffaut for this he gets Hitchcock for this one and only time to walk through basically every single one of his movies, every single choice he made, and how complex his thinking was about storytelling. And this is what makes him become Hitchcock, this book. So Truffaut that's why I'm nervous, Jim. I'm just like, holy shit, we're talking about one of the greats here.
Right. He didn't only make a great film. He also made Hitchcock.
He did. Like Hitchcock's movies made Hitchcock, but he was the one who pointed out, he was like, you morons, I don't like Rear Window because I'm looking at Greenwich Village. I'm looking at perfection in cinema, right? Like, you idiots, this is one of the most incredible pieces of conversations about voyeurism ever created. And he understood that, and he was, and there was another one, I listened to this interview, because Spielberg was a little obsessed with Truffaut, and had him play the scientist in one of his first films, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And Truffaut's like, I don't speak English. This is really fucking hard, man. and so Spielberg was like surprised by his good nature and plainness. He thought he was going to be meeting this like incredible like theorist, and they were going to have deep conversations, and and that just didn't happen. He wasn't that type of person in person. I mean, I think you have some notes about how he was like preferred the simple in cinema, right? Yeah. And but he talked about like he's like there's the American New Wave, and that's what's also kind of important here is like the French New Wave, which 400 Blows is the first film of, is a precursor to the new Hollywood, right, of the 60s and 70s, right, which Spielberg and George Lucas and Scorsese and Coppola are all a part of. And he said, like, Spielberg was talking about, like, if you sat all of us, like, New Wave guys, American New Wave guys down, and Truffaut was there, he would know more than all of us put together. Right, he was like, that man loves movies more than anyone I've ever known. He just had this endless respect for him.
I was thinking about this, and I don't know if it works, but after not only watching 400 Blows, which I'd seen before, I loved it. I understand why it's considered a masterpiece, and we could talk about that. But I was also, while I was listening to some of the other kind of minutia around the film that you had included in our little grab bag. One of the things he talks about is like, you don't need a big producer. You don't need a lot of money. I like to work with an amateur crew. And a lot of these elements were interesting. And he kind of scripts his films, but he doesn't. He allows folks to kind of improvise. And I was thinking, like, it sounds a lot like Cassavetes. And it's funny, Cassavetes makes Shadows in 59, which is the same year this comes out.
Yeah.
And Shadows kind of births the American independent film movement. And so it was interesting to think of these two parallel moments in cinema where Cassavetes and Truffaut have a lot in common. I also love reading about Cassavetes absolutely hating method acting and think it's like a psychological cult. And like you just have to. So I just love some of that. But it was interesting to me, to think about these two figures. I don't think Cassavetes is nearly as theoretical in that regard as a critic, but he has very clear principles about how to make a good film and how to avoid, a lot of the crap that Hollywood's producing. So anyway, as an aside, I was fascinated thinking about Truffaut and hearing him talk so explicitly about his method. And clearly, like, he is not an academic in the way you might imagine a film critic being.
No, not at all.
He is very clear about what makes a good film and what doesn't, and why. And I really like that. It was very refreshing to hear him talk about film. He was very, very not only articulate but very comprehensible.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of the classic thing that we've talked about this in the context of higher education. The idea is, there are academics that wrap their theory with the laden, gauze or the lenses that are of the words of discourse, rather than just talking plainly to everyone about what things mean. And I think that's in large part it makes sense from where he came from. It's like he's a kid of the streets, literally, right? Yeah. And he's self-taught, and he was infamous for his criticism of French film, right? And so he's like banned from Cannes the year before he wins the Palme d'Or, which is so amazing. Like, they hated him so much. They're like, middle fingers to Truffaut for being a critic who can't stand French film. To the very next year, they're like, bow at the altar of our savior, right? Yeah. It's remarkable.
And it's interesting. One of his colleagues, I think it was the one who was making films with him early on, I forget his name, talks about...
Godard?
Not Godard. Maybe it was Godard, but...
Or Renoir, maybe.
I think it might have been the guy who actually helped him make 400 Blows. But...
Oh, okay.
Mousy?
Yeah.
Musset, there you go. And so he talks about the fact that it was a risky endeavor for him to make this film because how many people he had pissed off, and everyone had their knives sharpened, ready for this to suck, and for them to attack it. And so it's interesting for him to thinking about I better make a good film because I made a lot of enemies in French cinema who are going to come after me with claws out. So I like that piece of it, like him, practicing what he preaches and sitting down and going from critic to filmmaker and having so much success at it is pretty remarkable, right?
And it's why it makes me think of Tarantino too, like this idea of this person who's like an aesthetic, what is the word, aestheticist or whatever the hell the word is.
Aesthete?
Yeah, my malapropisms in this podcast are just endless, right? So anyway, like this person who's obsessed with cinema and like is an intense critic. It's like going to what's the store in the video place in the East Village, the famous like all
Kim's Mondo Video.
Kim's Video. He's like literally the nerd, film nerd who like scowls at people that don't know films the way he does, but he's not that. He just loves them, and I think that's kind of what Truffaut, Tarantino is and was. He wasn't the scowling nerd. He was just the super fan, right?
Yeah,
the absolute super fan. And that's the difference. It's like he isn't the critic who thumbs his nose at someone that doesn't share his taste. He's just like a super fan and he wants it to be better, right? He thinks there's better. And so, he stays on safe grounds ultimately because it's very much an autobiographical film, right? And, he crafts this space that he feels ultimately, I guess, very comfortable in. And I think we should just get into it. And I love it. Starts basically in a French grammar school. Set the scene of what's French grammar school like. We should back up. One thing is like, ultimately, I have one last thought. This is a family picture in large part because it's the first film that's really ever produced from the point of view of a child, right? Successfully. And we like the Breakfast Club owes homage to this film as this like we can tell stories from the point of view of young adults and or teenagers and whatnot. It's not just the romance of parents and how they have to deal with their children, which are clearly things to be ignored. But this is an incredible portrait of a kid's point of view. And then when you have kids' points of view, it's ultimately the parents are involved because they're still children.
Yeah.
But let's start in school first, right? What's school like in France in 1950?
I'll back you up for a second because I believe even before we get to school, we're driving around Paris.
Yeah.
And we're looking at like all these amazing Parisian kind of, street scenes. And we drive past the Eiffel Tower. In fact, that's where we're ultimately headed. And we end there. And it's just so beautiful. Like, I mean, another example of like, I think film is all about the power of place. And I really feel like Paris is a huge character in this film. Down to the cinemas and all of that.
Right.
So that's pretty clear. I'm not saying anything.
It's the power
Marvel.
It's a power of authentic places, right? And I think that's like your deep dive into Firstborn's screenshots of the house of 1984 suburban, New Jersey is, an exemplar of your love of that. And I agree. Like I have students literally right now trying to make a fiction film, even though we don't teach fiction filmmaking. And I say the hardest thing to pull off is building an authentic world. Like that, you have your characters, you have your actors, you have your script, but can you have them inhabit spaces? Can you shoot those spaces in ways that we believe they're really part of that place, right? Yeah. And Paris is this incredible character, and all these spaces that you would never know, because I mean we're not French, so it's
a new world. I've only been to Paris recently, frankly.
Yeah.
But I mean, to your point, as we go into school. One of those pieces of authenticity, like we get with Firstborn, and I'm not trying to compare. I was talking about Firstborn when my wife and I were watching this one. She's like, "Are you really comparing Firstborn to Forge of Blows?" I'm like, "No, I'm not really." But the authenticity of the kids in that classroom.
Yeah.
And this comes throughout the film.
Yeah.
There are some amazing moments.
Yeah.
And,
the Punch and Judy
beautiful.
is so incredible.
Punch and Judy is probably one of the great scenes in cinema. I would think. It's
agree.
So powerful.
Yeah, we'll get to that. It's incredible, though.
It's amazing. But that's the same with the kids in this class. Obviously, you have this 14-year-old street urchin that he pulls in because he's that, because he's kind of... And he plays it to a T.
The street urchin is Jean-Pierre Léaud, who plays Antoine Daniel. And Jean-Pierre Léaud is literally, he's like the classic story of the kid who's plucked out of nowhere to become this person who becomes a movie star. And he repeats this character in 3 more films with Truffaut. I don't think anywhere near to the same success. But at the same time, he's just a remarkable find, and we're so lucky to have had him play this role.
Okay, I'm going to do another aside, and I'm sorry, because when you do a film like
we're
this...
We're never going to start this movie.
You do a film like this, it's very hard to not want to talk about everything.
Right.
But in some of the kind of documentaries I saw around this, you have him talking about his relationship to Truffaut, and the interviewer says, "Do you feel like you look like Truffaut?" And he says, I think you look like all the people you love. And that's a kind of really remarkable moment between this actor and this director, and that relationship that lasts, like you said,
decades.
Kind of like the Up series we talked about when we talked about
like
Firstborn.
Michael Apted,
following him for years, but also how different than Corey Haim in Firstborn, who's kind of left to the side. This kid and Truffaut have this obviously, parental, this film almost parental relationship that goes on for 20, 30, 40 years. Yeah. And it's really powerful to think about that relationship between them, and it seems quite authentic. So I just thought that was marvelous, as opposed to some of the shit we see in Hollywood in the 80s where these kids are disposable.
I mean, the exception, I think, is, this isn't a child actor, but it's this reminds me of the Before Sunrise series with Richard Linklater and Richard Linklater's relationship with Ethan Hawke. And they go on to make 3 more films, right? And it's Before Sunset, Before Midnight. Yeah. And it's this, and it's also very similar, it's almost documentary style, right? Before Sunset. Richard Linklater, as we know, is infamous for just wanting people to just be who they are, right? And inhabit these spaces of authenticity. I think they're very similar directors in that way in this context. And Ethan Hawke talked about how with Richard Linklater, there was such incredible trust in he wanted to go back to him again and again because Linklater let him effectively help write his character, write his lines. And Ethan, this is one of those things where you get spoiled. It's this is because this is one of his first roles. It's am I going to get to do this all the time? And of course not.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So the school, we're finally, what's French grammar school like?
It's strict. And the teacher's a jackass. Just like in Firstborn.
In a smoking jacket. But he's wearing a smoking jacket the whole time. I want to know what that jacket's about.
Yeah. And I mean, the teacher is great. I love his hair. The way his hair is kind of like a Dilbert character. Yeah. And the fact that he's one of the more memorable characters of the film. And I think, he's strict. There's this sense that, he sees this class and this particular kid, Antoine, as a complete, fuck up. And he's not afraid to say it. No. And he, reiterates it. And it's abusive to the degree that we would imagine.
It totally is.
School in the 60s was probably a different sense.
Teachers are very physical. They're grabbing people and pushing them around and shoving them in corners and pulling them off, literally throwing things, right? Oh, that actually happened in the 80s. I had someone throw an eraser at someone else's head near me back in the 80s still. That was still around.
But even by 80s standards, this guy was, he was the king of his castle. He could do whatever he wanted in his classroom. And there was moments where he, had some humanity, but not in the immediate, right? In the immediate, he was abusive, and he was attacking these kids. And then he would have them recite this hair poem, which I don't know if it's a real poem.
Yeah, and I love the kid who and everybody's trying as quickly as possible. He's reciting a poem and recording it on the blackboard. So he's reciting it from memory, and all the kids are expected to write it down. And there's this one poor kid with his inkwell pen, and he's just tearing page after page out of his blue book, suffering as he tries to start over and over and over again. And that's the first of one of the things that I can't say enough about this. It is so packed with storytelling. Like, it's the amount of storytelling. It would be so easy to just, oh, he's reciting and all the kids are trying busily to do it. But instead, he focuses on this one kid who's just suffering to manage his blue book, like in tearing pages out of it. And it just...
I always saw that as slapstick.
It is.
It's a bit of slapstick.
I was laughing out loud. It's really funny. But it is this choice to find yet another little story in these moments, right?
So there's the Hair poem, which is there seems to be about slavery and this kind of emancipation from your kind of keepers, which is funny because, Antoine writes a poem on the wall as he's been told to go to the corner.
Yeah, he's being denied education yet again.
And it's about his own emancipation from, the prison that is school. And once the teacher realizes he wrote it, he says, go get something to wipe that rubbish off the wall, or I'll make you lick it off, which I think is one of my favorite moments. I just love that. It's just also such a beautiful line because you can see him licking it off the wall. But it's just, the classroom is amazing. He creates an amazing world in just that little room with those kids and that adult. It is superb.
Right. And there's this wonderful moment towards the end of the scene where the teacher is bemoaning the state of kids like every teacher does. And he says, poor France will be in sorry shape in 10 years. And I was like, oh, my God, this is Bender. This is what keeps me up at night, that these kids are going to be taking care of us in 10, 15 years. And the janitor's like, don't count on that.
Exactly. Well, I'll tell you, one of the things, and this might be a good follow-up movie to this, is we were watching this, and Antonella was watching it and loved it. So I can get her to watch certain films, like when we watch great European masterpieces, she's in. Stepfather, not so much.
No, well, me too.
Exactly, you and Antonella.
Yeah, so I get forced.
She reminded me of the scene in Amicord by Fellini, where they're all in school, and the teacher is reciting this Greek poem and is so kind of like into it. And the kid, he's trying to get the kid to pronounce the Greek right. He's like, you got to use the tongue. And the kid's like, and he does this raspberry. He keeps doing it. It's just awesome. So it takes that Fellini fantastic comedy, but they're very similar scenes in some way. And there's a very kind of, I don't think Fellini has the verita, right? This kind of truth in the same way that and that would be interesting to talk about. But anyway, this scene reminded me of that Fellini moment in Amicord. And it's just, I love it. It's so great to have these kind of moments in school when you're being formed and you can tell so much about a culture in just a couple of minutes. There's Marise,
who's like the prudish kid who's the teacher's pet and has the goggles, and they end up destroying them in a later scene because they hate him so much while he's reciting perfectly his poem. And then Marise becomes this kid that after school they're like, you're such a rat, just go to hell, we're gonna kick your ass if you keep this up, But then there's also this one kid who participates later on in the beating of his glasses, who stands out to me for nothing other than just his facial expressions, the way he conjures this, that kid is just a real kid and he has his own life and personality and just thoughts, and he has no lines whatsoever in the entire film, and he has darker eyes and whatnot. It's that's a real human being. And that's what I'm saying. This he creates, and this is something Spielberg mentioned actually in this interview too, they're doing, shooting for Close Encounters, and Spielberg was asking him for thoughts, and Truffaut respectfully declined most of the time, but occasionally he'd say hey, those guys in the background that are picking their nose and doing, picking their butts, it's shoot them. It's he's just interested in these little moments. Those are and Spielberg's those are the extras, but it's that's what he was interested in, right?
Yeah, that's great.
And so it's kind of remarkable. So, but now we move on to the real family, right? The familial structure, and we go into their home. And boy, what a little home this is.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty abject little apartment. There's moments where you see the bed is right up against the door that they come
it's like
in.
A classic tenement house from the East Village or something, right?
Yeah, it is squalid. And so basically it's interesting because you go in with him and he steals money right away.
Yeah.
He's stealing money, which is I can relate to that. But then he's like making the table and then sitting at his mom's makeup table and like adjusting his eyelashes with that tool. And it's just kind of like in this small world, even that small squalid apartment is a world that Truffaut opens up.
Right.
And it's just great.
Yeah. Why have this moment of him just sitting at his mother's like dressing table, but he's playing with her eyelash crimper, and he's also framed. There's two mirrors, so we get these two images of Antoine, through the mirror, and but then his mother comes home though, right? And instantly she's on his ass. Like it's like he's like, "Did you get the flower?" And he's like, I gave you a list of stuff to get. He's like, I lost it. He's instantly lying. Like, I lost it. He knows he's totally just forgotten. But it's all this, everything is transactional, sadly, with his mother. There's no care, like, how was your day? What happened? It's just like, go get the flower. And it's just all like, take out the garbage, but then his father shows up too, right? We meet his father for the first time, who's much more lighthearted, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And the mother, it's interesting with the mother. It's like there's no sentimentality at all for the kid. And you really get that feeling in that house. And it's interesting, like, because, it's you can feel his pain. I think that's part of that perspective from this 14-year-old. Like, he feels that pain. But, it's interesting to me because that gets to the point where this is not a nostalgic look back on the perfect, family unit. This is a troubled space for everybody involved, not just for the kid,
Yeah, everybody's like hiding money from one another, right? Like there's this like, when his father comes in, he asks for money probably for the movies or just for the day, and he asks for 1,000 francs, and he's like, well, that means you probably need 500. So that means I could give you 300, and instead he gives him 100,
Yeah.
And then later on, there's a moment where the dad is asking his wife about, I gave you money to buy sheets. Where are the sheets? And she's like, I blame the kid, right? And she's blaming him. And so everybody's like hiding and negotiating for different amount of money and for the groceries. And, like we said, we saw him stealing from the stash in the dining room. It's pretty intense.
Yeah, I agree. It is. It's definitely not a phlegmatic home life, if you will. Right. There's a lot of dynamics that are pretty unhealthy.
Right. And so this leads to, and even though the father seems a little more lighthearted, in this particular scene, and it's like, oh, I'm into racing, and they're trying to put up this poster of the racing club he's part of, which is kind of fun, and so you can see Antoine is trying to make this connection with him and has a connection with him, even though it doesn't tend to last, which leads to, escape is a big part of this picture. And he and his best friend, Renee, skip school for the first time. Right. And for the
first time in the film.
In the film, right.
Yeah.
No, not. I imagine clearly it is not the first time they skipped school.
Exactly. It's habitual.
Yeah. And they have this whole routine where they hide they're called briefcases, right? Like, no, they don't have backpacks. They have briefcases, and they hide them behind a door. And, Marseille is like a little sneaky dick, and he's like watching out for him, right? We'll come to back to that later.
He's a rat.
He's a total rat.
Oh God.
And they immediately go to play some pinball. They find an arcade and are playing pinball, and then there's this carnival. And there's the scene with the rotor. Did you ever go on a rotor when you were a kid?
I have, absolutely. Yes.
Oh, I was terrified of the rotor. I would not. We had Riverside Park was our amusement park, and the Cyclone was like the roller coaster that I was terrified of. But I did, and I'll never forget my first trip on the Cyclone. It was like one of those like. It's similar to the Cyclone that's down on Cody Island, but it was much bigger at the time. And those roller coasters are psychotic. They have like a lap belt, and they're wooden, and they shake like a maniac. Like, how do people just not go flying out of these things? But the rotor is a special. What's the rotor? Tell me your rotor story, and how did you end up on a rotor anyway?
So there was a rotor of all things at our fireman's field. It was just a kind of like a traveling carnival.
Right.
And so they set up a rotor.
What is it? Yeah, tell people what it is.
It's basically a big cylinder that you go in, all metal, and then it just really spins really fast. And centripetally, you're pushed up against the wall. So you're like, oh, and in this rotor, I don't know if it's all rotors, the floor drops out.
All rotors, so they drop the floor out.
Against it, and then you don't have any, like, you're not touching anything. And like he does in the film shot, which is so amazing, you can go completely upside down. Right. You can go 90-degree angles. You can do whatever you want because the thing is spinning so fast that you're just kind of plastered against the cylinder wall. And you basically, if you can move and you have that kind of spirit in you, like the kid, you could just do whatever you want against that wall. It's freaking awesome.
No, I was like, it was known as like the equivalent of the vomit comet. Like people just, people got sick out of that. And I was just like too terrified. So I personally have never done it. And I am still never going to do it. But it's so funny too, because it's this very, French scene at the same time, because you have these people that are middle-aged or young adults. You can't quite tell. And they're because it's the 50s still, and so people always dress formally in public, and so it's just so odd to see these really well-dressed people in this simple amusement park ride, right? I mean, that's what a different era.
And the idea that you get that point of view of the kid looking up, and there's people at the top of it looking in, which wasn't my experience because it was just they didn't have that infrastructure.
Oh, we did it at Riverside Park. They did. That's what was so nuts.
You could look in, and you could see it, and then he was filming it outside. And I mean, just filmically, what
it's incredible.
Brilliant shot.
And he does all these things where that come up. So. This also leads to a post. They run into his mom, and she's making out with a man on the streets. That's not his dad. And so, and this I learned later on was one of the reasons that Italy didn't accept 400 blows, because they wanted to cut scenes, and particularly this one, for moral reasons, right? This and the escaping from reform school, right?
Yeah.
And so he talked about, like, obviously the film was super celebrated around the world, but like Italy was like, nah, and Germany too, apparently.
And Spain.
You must follow the rules.
Yeah, exactly. How interesting is that? And yet they still had Fellini.
Right. Yeah. So and so after running into his mom, she's going to be late at work, so he actually has dinner alone with his dad. And so, very unlike his mother, we're back home again. His dad is actually interested in him, right? He's like, asking about his day. Like, he's lying about his day at school, but he's asking about his day. Yeah. And, he tries to give some context.
Show some initiative.
Yeah, show some context of but he also he defends his mother because he knows she's a bit of a bitch to him, right? And, it's like, well, it's hard for your mom. She's, at work. She's a secretary, and secretaries have it really rough. They're constantly being basically sexually harassed, and that's normal. But at the same time, so, there's these things like he's like, and so there's just like, and he's reminding him to remember his mom's birthday. So he's this person who is engaged with the human being that is 14 years old in Antoine. But at the same time,
the father figure is so animated. I love that character.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I just love looking at his face.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, let me look his up. The actor's name is
he's wonderful.
Albert Remy. Yeah, he's wonderful. With his really long face and long nose, it's wonderful. Yeah. And so, but at the same time, the stepfather's like, we haven't revealed it. It is actually a stepfather, but that comes up later. And we actually learn that later this evening in the evening, because
although you see it when he says, he took my name, I gave him my name.
Right, because that's when the parents fight later that night. And this is this weird thing of, we learn, Antoine literally sleeps in what appears to be like a passageway between the dining room kitchen and the rear exit to the stairwell of apartment. So it's not a bedroom at all.
No.
And it's like, it's where the garbage literally sits, and they always remind him to take the garbage out so you don't sleep with garbage that night. It's fucking gross.
Oh, and when he goes down to throw out the garbage, it's, again, another scene of squalor. Oh,
yeah.
It's disgusting.
Yeah, and that's when we learn he's not his father. Like, his parents are fighting yet again and there's this other thing that's so wonderful, like this notion of, after there's fighting, and they can't help but it's like a passageway. They're going back and forth, and the idea of like kids pretending to be asleep in front of their adults. And I was like, man, this is something so true, right? It's so truthful, right? What kid has not pretended to be asleep in front of their parent, right?
Yeah, there's so many great moments like that. And there is obviously hard moments with them. Like you said, with the stepdad, what is essentially the stepdad, this is a great moment. They're like, we have a boys' night, we're going to cook eggs, we're going to do our thing. And then he's like, where's my Michelin guide? And the kid's like, I don't know, I never touched it. And then he's pissed off about it. That little son of a Gunderson has taken the Michelin guide, and we learn that later on. But there's that element to him. Like, even Truffaut takes the long game with him to show, like, he's a good liar, and he's not messing around. Like, this kid is a delinquent.
He's a total delinquent. And it's really interesting because we'll get to it at the end. There's this narrative. He gives his entire backstory, right? So the next morning, he gets set up by the rat so bad. What a freaking rat. Marie shows up to his apartment and knocks on the door, and they're both the mother and stepmother are like, who the hell's at our door? And they're like, is it the gas man? They're all freaked out.
That's the best. Is it the gas company? No, they have to give us a warning.
Yeah. And so it's Maurice, and he's like, oh, I just stopped by to see if Antoine's okay. He was sick yesterday and not in school, so he's busted. He busts him. What a little slime ball. And so this leads to they're back in school, and one of the saddest moments in any child's life because he goes to school and he doesn't have a note, and he fabricates this ridiculous lie, right?
What do you think about that lie, though?
Oh, it's insane.
So essentially, he goes and he says, why in the not so what they call sourpuss is what they call the teacher. Sourpuss basically says, why did you miss out? You can't get away without a note. This isn't going to be that easy for you. And the kid, and Truffaut talks about this scene of getting the kid to actually do it the way he wanted to. Mm-hmm. And the kid basically says, because my mom died or something, but he lifts his head up.
She's dead.
She's dead. Yeah, my mom's dead, or some element of that. And obviously the teacher is like, oh, wait, and everything changes, and you see the humanity of the teacher, and there's that moment. But this little kid just lied about his mom dying, which is like, isn't that a mortal sin somewhere? Like, don't you go to hell for that right away? Like, there's no, so I just think that is awesome. Like, and also, like, maybe a little bit of wishful thinking, given his mom is so damn cold.
Yeah. There's later, so he gets busted, and this is this classic situation. Like, the parents show up at school because Maurice's ratted him out, and they know they have to go to school and find out, is he even there today? And so he happens to be there. He turns around and sees his parents in the background, and now Sourpuss has seen his mom is there. And this is that moment every child has endured where you're busted. You're so busted, like deeply busted in a way that you're like, I don't know what my life will ever be like again. I am never recovering from this. It's the end of me. And Pierre Leo does this in a way that you're just like, holy cow, it's the worst feeling on the planet. Like, I mean, who hasn't been busted for something that there's no coming back from? Yeah. And the crazy thing is, so this leads to the first time he's going to run away, and running away is like kind of interesting. But the funny thing is, so he leaves a note for his parents. And this leads to his thoughts about his mother, because they read the note and he talks about, I'll see you later. And they know, like, because they talk about, no, or maybe this was after the principal talk. And it's like, his mom's like, why did he kill me off? And the dad's like, wait, I have to get the quote. The dad's response is, oh shoot, I'm so annoyed. It's basically, personal preference, obviously.
Now, help me out with the timeline. Is this before or after they go to he sets the Balzac shrine on fire, and then they go to the.
This is before. So he runs away for the first time, right?
Gotcha.
The first time he runs away, he ends up like Renee, the best friend of all time, right? Sets him up in his dad's like printing factory for the night, and it's short-lived.
Oh, that's right.
It's like he has to, because, it's a newspapers, and the newspaper, they probably get there at like 3 a.m. So he ends up walking the streets for a good part of the night. And there's this, again, random scene where a woman lets a dog out of her apartment by accident and immediately tries to get him to help find it. But then there's another man who sees this, and then Antoine and this random man are competing for her affection. Like, this is like another story out of nowhere,
Yeah, it's great. And, it also, like, the way adults treat kids in this film is its own thing. Like, kids are basically supposed to be invisible.
Yeah.
Just be compliant and shut up. And once there's an issue, like, that's it. You know what I mean? Like, it's interesting, a very different view of childhood.
Well, that's, I think, like Mad Men did that too. I always think of Don Draper's home and Peggy, is it Peggy or Betty? And just the way they treated their kids as like mini servants, or just shut up, like don't talk, like not to be heard, fetch drinks. That's about it. Like it is a 50s idea of parenthood.
Yeah. And of childhood, right?
Right, and resultantly of childhood. And so, so this is, it's a very, the funny thing, so he runs away, but he goes to school the next day, right? And so his mother finds him there because she's so freaked out because he spent the night outside of the house, and she picks him up and cleans him up at home, and she's seemingly maternal for a minute, and then tries to make a connection with him by basically talking about herself, right? And this is like her failure. She doesn't talk to him ever, really. She explains, this is what you are, this is what I was. And then she tries to buy his affections with this promise of a good grade if he gets a good grade on his paper, which leads to the whole thing with this brief return to normalcy, and is like he falls in love. We learn his love of Balzac, right? And he's reading Balzac.
And he has a Balzac shrine.
And
he actually, lights a votive to Balzac,
Yep.
Not realizing, as he closes up in paper, that it might go on fire. It goes on fire. The father freaks out. You know, he puts the mother and father put it out.
Yeah.
And then the mother, of all things, at this moment, is like, let's go to the movies.
Yeah.
I just love that scene because they go from house on fire to let's go to the movies. And that scene with them going to the movies and then coming out of the movies, 'cause you never really see them in the movies, is like one of the few really joyous moments.
Correct. Yeah.
In the family moment. Like the family is like laughing.
Yep.
And, you know, the stepfather says, I don't think it was funny. And the mother says, I think it was deep. And the kid is just like, I love the movie. I just love
like
being in the
movies.
movie, right? Like, and you got a sense of them, like, at that moment, like, you were like, you know, there's possibility here. Like, it's not all gloom and doom.
No.
And I love that. Like, that moment is one of my favorite of the movies. I just think it's just a joyous moment. Not that
and they're quoting lines from the movie to one another as they're coming upstairs to the apartment that's filled with smoke, but they don't care, right?
They don't care, exactly.
And it's because they have this moment of levity as a family, as a real, like, any family you would hope have.
And you get the sense, even though you saw her with another man in the street just the day before, you get the sense that, like, she still loves him. Like, it's not like one or the other. And I also like that idea that it wasn't just, you know, she was ready to get rid of this, you know, idiot and join with troops with this new guy. I mean, there was a lot of complexity in just that simple telling of that moment that I really loved.
Yeah. And this, sadly, but this moment is brief, and the next trigger is not as, you know, it's again school that causes it. Because Sourpuss completely, you know, because their papers are, we get a sense like their papers are something they write in person, live, right? Like they're not something they do for homework and then turn in. It's something like, because that's how the scene, the original, and you get I'm making this, I'm guessing at this based on the first scene where we see they're just writing. They have 5 minutes, 2 minutes, or like 3 seconds. Like they've been writing a paper, right? And so this is how papers are written. They're like something to be done on the spot, like an exam. And So he's written this paper, and he's like basically quoted Balzac, his favorite, as this story, and the teacher just doesn't believe it's possible and immediately accuses him of cheating.
Yeah. Yeah,
plagiarism.
plagiarism.
And so this is the next trigger. And he's like, I'm done. I can't go back home. I can't go back to school. And so Renee takes him to his house. And so we get the second family structure.
My God. Exactly. What a family. Like, you get into this, like, I don't know what it is, studio where the father has his stuffed horse.
Yes, it's a real stuffed horse. It's crazy.
Great. And these, like, multiple meowing cats that sound like they're about to die.
Yeah, they're yelling at everybody.
And while they have more space than Antoine's apartment, it's still almost equally as abject. Because you get the sense that the mother is drunk and she's hawking all their valuables. The father is always at the racetrack. And, like, that family is equally as, dysfunctional as Antoine's.
Right.
And it's kind of sad. And, like, even though it's you can get the sense it could be a nice apartment, it's falling apart.
Right.
And, it's overrun by cats. And it's just, there's not a lot of love there either.
No, and Renee, like, has to, so he sets up Antoine in his bedroom, which is like, they never come in here. We don't even know it's his bedroom at first, but later learn it's his bedroom. It's like, they never come in here, so don't worry. And he has dinner with his dad, but he advances the clock to 9:30 because he knows it will alarm. So his dad hears the alarm go off, and he's up like a shot. And he's like, oh, gotta go to the club. It's time to go to the club. And then he immediately puts the clock back, and then they proceed to have a night together that's wonderful. Like two boys they're literally drinking wine and smoking and playing games. But sadly, this again is not to last because, well, no, that's not true. They kind of get this plan, because they are like, we got to set you up for, we need some seed money to set you up for until, you can find work or whatever their plan is. And because they're kids, they make stupid plans. And so this proceeds to the plan making to steal a typewriter is mentioned, but it doesn't matter because it's done in the context of this scene where kids are watching a Punch and Judy puppet show.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just astounding how Truffaut captures this crowd of 40, 50, 4-year-olds watching a Punch and Judy puppet show. And he just is so in love with these children. And the way he picks out their responses to it. And I could have spent 5 minutes in that space with those kids. It's one of the most authentic things I've ever seen in film.
Yeah, it's amazing. And obviously they're reacting to the violence of the wolf and the bat and the two going at it. And, you see their response. And you get a sense that the camera has been there. So they've kind of forgotten about the camera, and they're watching the Punch and Judy.
They absolutely are.
But
the kids have no idea.
Yeah, and they are transfixed by this going on. And I couldn't help but think of, obviously, The Shining with Wendy and Jack Torrance, and that whole Punch and Judy show on the stairs as they go up. And this idea of familial violence and that idea of what Punch and Judy's kind of working through, and just all these beautiful, innocent kids, and them looking at that kind of, that portal into a world that's both entertaining, but there's also an unfortunate reality of truth to that kind of, back and forth violence that they're going to have to kind of encounter on their way. But you found them at that moment where it's still just magic. And I think his ability to capture that, like you said, it just makes it, for me, one of the most astounding shots series of shots I've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, the final one is just a boy leaning his head against his friend. It's it's just incredible. I mean, it's
great.
It's insanely beautiful, but it is disrupted by their plan to steal a typewriter from his dad's office. And it just, of course, goes awry so quickly. They try to find a guy to fence it, and the guy who's trying to fence it actually tries to steal it from them, and then they get it back, and so then he tries to return it, and then Antoine gets caught. And this is the beginning of the end, where Antoine is pushed into the system. And his parents, his stepfather chooses to take him to the police instead of going home.
Yeah. That's hard. I mean, that's a hard. There's a series of hard decisions here between both the mom and the dad, and you see the dad and mom struggling with it, like because they're basically saying like Antoine's gonna now be or has to now be a ward of the state,
Right.
and they kind of agree with it, and
Right.
they're like, there's nothing else we can do. Whether we have failed him or whether our system or the way we parent is not working, we no longer have the tools to deal with this. And
Right.
it's a sad moment because I think they recognize that, and the mother talks a little bit about the fact that it's not, the stepfather's child, and that there are kind of questions there that, obviously the judge has kind of brought up, but it's a sad moment. I think it's a tormenting moment because you also see, and they don't let on too much, but you gotta believe that the stepfather, and the mother are also going through a certain amount of turmoil as
Right.
they hand their kid over to the authorities.
But the way that Antoine is processed, right? He's processed, right?
Yeah, truly.
And this is like authentic understanding of a system, the way that like David Simon in The Wire understands the system, right? Like this is someone who's been in it, or in David Simon's case, reported on it extensively.
Yeah.
And so Truffaut, we know, has been it. He was a juvenile delinquent. He was arrested. Like he was put in jail for trying to desert the army at age 18. And, he's just pushed from spot to spot. And he's always like, that's part of the physicality of this film of adults with children. Like the teachers are very physical with them and pushing them around and get in the corner, or his dad's pushing him against the wall. It's like, where's my Michelin guide? And now he's literally being pushed into little pens because in France, these jails, the jail cell, like the pre-process, is not prison. It's like literally a fenced box of fencing, and it's a cage that's in the office. It reminds me of Barney Miller, like it's like in the office with the actual cops, the people that are being processed they're in these little mini pens in these jails in the same room as the police themselves.
Yeah, and he's moved from the bigger one, because the prostitutes seemingly come in. And so he's put to this little almost closet pen. And it's really interesting because it's another moment where you get the point of view shot with him looking out through the fencing and seeing like the world in which like he finds himself, if you will.
Right.
And there's a couple of moments like that.
Yeah, there's this. Yeah, and he's taken to the next step in the processing, and he and all the prostitutes and the man are put in a paddy wagon, and there's this extended set of shots as he's driving around, and we finally, for the first time, see tears in Antoine's eyes. Right, like it's like I'm fucked, and and yet. And the next place he's processed, like it's the classic, he's a boy, and they're like, empty your pockets, and he's got a ton of shit. Like he's just a boy, It's like, well, of course I have like this and this and this. And they put him in
cigarettes.
Yeah, and in another cell, but he saves some tobacco that are in his jacket pockets, and he rolls a cigarette. Like the storytelling, there's all these little endless little moments. And then he meets with his mom, and she is just kind of relentless. It's like, this isn't our fault. I mean, I'm sad, but we have to do this. And he goes to the observation center, which is like, reform school. And it's a new prison. And the way that reform school scene opens is like a man takes 3 little girls and shoves them in a pen outside.
It's so weird. But was he taking those girls and putting them in the pen to preserve them from the boys?
Maybe
there? I think that's the
case.
You're
probably right, to protect them from the boys.
Children.
That makes sense. Yeah,
and then he put them in there because the boys were coming. You know what I mean?
Wow, you're right.
Which is so interesting.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it was just nuts. And so this is where the kind of, I think, final reveal of Antoine's history is given. It's really weird. So he's interviewed by a psychologist.
Yeah.
And Antoine just opens up and he talks about, and this is literally true to life. It's like, Truffaut lived with his grandmother until he was 8. So this is part of his detachment from his mother. He adored his grandmother, lived with her till he was 8 years old, and then she died. And so he had to go back. He had to. It's not they wanted him. He had to go live with them. And so Antoine's telling this story. He actually talks about stealing money from his grandmother, even though and then getting caught, and them taking the book that she gave him. And, you know, his
They didn't
mother's
believe what I said anyway, so why not lie?
Oh, and he
right?
talks about lying. Yes, he talks about how he lies because he's like, I prefer it because even when I tell the truth, they don't believe me.
Yeah.
He tells the story, and oh my God, Jean-Pierre Lude's like response to, he asked him, "Have you ever slept with a girl?" And he's just so bashful. But then he goes on to tell this story about how his friends have had prostitutes and they tried to get him a prostitute. And they found one, but then she wasn't there, so it didn't work out. You know, it's just crazy. And so we get this total like dump on us, like this narrative dump on us. And we know all this information now. And his mother comes to see him. And so does Renee tries to see him too. He's so excited to see Renee, but Renee's not allowed in. And so his mother, and this is the final conversation with his mother, and she's just talking about how no good he is, you know, and his history, and that this is all his fault. And what does Antoine notice and focus on? Her new hat. Truffaut pans he's above her eyes, and he's like, "Where's this new hat coming from? This really expensive chapeau, right?" And he knows like this is nothing he's ever going to connect to. And, you know, it leads to this final image of Antoine running away, and he makes it to the sea. And there's these two incredibly long dolly shots, like running along the countryside, and then another dolly shot as he runs across the beach at low tide to the sea. And then Truffaut's just like, it's over.
Yeah. That freeze frame, that kind of tableau, boom.
And there's no credits. It's fiend, you know, and that is like, yeah, that's what it was like. And so it's like this incredible portrait of, I mean, and there's so much, you could just endlessly talk about all the little scenes that existed in prior to that. Like one of my favorites is like when all the boys go on gym class running through the city, and it's like a cartoon, how like 3 kids drop off and then another 3 kids and then another 3 kids. And there's all these like Truffaut, he did the same dump. This was his dump. You know, this first film was his dump of all of these experiences and all of these things, all these teeny little moments he was able to capture about being a kid who's neglected. And thank God he found Andre Bazin, right, who he dedicates the film to.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me, one of the things I was thinking of as an older person, that he's here at 25 making this film about a, say, 14 or 15-year-old, Truffaut. And I think that proximity also works to his favor. You know what I mean? And the fact that he was not that far away, 9 or 10 years. And, there is something, I mean, I think it's just amazing. Like, there was someone, Scorsese said, films you should watch before you turn 16, right? And this is one of them. And I think that's an interesting idea of this film.
Right.
Like, it's a film about a 14-year-old's world, and I think, Linklater actually tried to do something like this with Boyhood and following him over time, right?
Yeah,
I don't think it has the same. I don't think it has the same, obviously, power as this, but like that idea of doing this and then trying to think, what films have done something similar since, and it's very hard. Now, I haven't seen everything, but it's very hard to think of a film as powerful dealing with a kid in the moment in a world that is, pretty bleak and brutal and not too many possibilities. I mean, he ends up essentially in prison for a young kid. Like, that's not a... Antonella, as we were getting ready to watch it, she's like, I don't know isn't this a depressing movie? I'm like, well, no. I mean, he's only a kid, and we know it's Truffaut, and then Truffaut becomes Truffaut, so it's not a terrible ending. But the ending, like you said, is that ending, that kind of sharp, defined ending, kind of suggesting, obviously, like, that's that. But also, we know, it being autobiographical, things turn out very differently for Truffaut. But what about all those other kids in that institution?
No, I know. I mean, it's all the other kids are like, that's what David Simon does when he does the season that's about school, and those 2 boys, like there's one that's bright, and they all just end up fucking hooked on, drugs and like ODing or getting killed. And he knows he's the exception, right? And he knows he's lucky that he had a passion that he was able to find a way to pursue it, and then it got recognized by someone, and that
yet,
person.
He tells the story, and it's not some rags to riches.
No,
I did it.
it's
right?
not sentimental
it's the
at all.
opposite, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
here's what it was.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's a tribute to every other kid who had a similar reality.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's I'm so glad we did this. We go all the way back to 1959 and 400
It's a hard
blows.
one, though, because it's such a masterpiece. So
Yeah.
you can't really do it justice.
No, I think we tried our best, but thank you, everyone. And, next time Jim's on deck, we'll see what he throws in my face for a movie, and I'm excited. Never excited.
Thanks.
But thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.